Thank you, Lisa. It's great to be here with you. And before we dive into the future, let's take a step back and look where we've come over these last, really, several hundred years. Now, let's see. Okay, so let's start with this guy. Ben Franklin, 1750. He proposes this idea that lightning might be electricity. We don't actually know when he performed that experiment, potentially June of 1752, a couple of years later. But this is really our common heritage. Then some of us in the room broke off to do energy production, energy distribution, all from this idea that electricity was coming from lightning. It would be another 120 years until we move forward and invent the incandescent light bulb. Only a few short years before Edison invents the first telephone, pulling together microphones and earpieces to create the first handset. So we think of Edison today as a provider of infrastructure for mobile telephony, but that legacy goes back several hundred years. So we have these very long, potentially very long innovation cycles. It's important to think about that as you walk through technology. Across this time, there's always been skeptics. One of my favorite was philosopher Hubert Dreyfus. He was a professor who argued at the time, 1965, that artificial intelligence was akin to alchemy, and at the time he wrote, no chess program can even play amateur chess. At the time when we were working with artificial intelligence, a lot of what we were doing was building chess programs. 1965. 1967, at MIT, Richard Greenblatt writes a chess program. They challenge Professor Dreyfus to a challenge, to a competition. He ultimately loses to that chess program just 2 short years after predicting that no chess program would ever be able to get beyond playing amateur chess. So we see how technology takes these sometimes long cycles and sometimes very short cycles. One of the other things to think about when it comes to innovation, especially with technology, is that when something moves from a from a scarcity to a surplus, we begin to waste it. So you can think about 1981, the Xerox Star was the first computer released that used a graphical user interface. Prior to that period, we would have never wasted computing power on creating a graphical user interface. We used computing power very scarcely because it was a scarcity. We used to check it out from universities. We used to queue up to get access to it. At about this time, 1980, 1981, computing power begins to move from a scarcity to a surplus, and so we start to waste it. We start to use it to create things like a graphical user interface, like a mouse icon. Ultimately, that Xerox Star, probably because of a price point, isn't commercially viable. But in 1984, just a few years later, Apple introduces the first commercially successful computer to use a graphical user interface. And today, most of us think about that. And if you look at the way computing has evolved and has changed, we waste computing power in a variety of ways today. You're starting to see more computers use touch. We would have never wasted computing power on rendering touch capabilities in that device, but it's moved from a scarcity to a surplus, and we start to waste it. 1998, we sell the first HD TV, and this really ushers in what I call the first digital decade, when we moved from analog devices to digital devices. Prior to this time, the only digital devices in a home were some portable CD players, which were introduced in 1981, and computers. Computers at this time in about 40% of US homes. Only about 3% of homes at this time had always-on internet connectivity. For the most part, we were a dial-up society. Very few of us actually owned computers, and we lived with analog devices. And then over the ensuing decade, we began to replace these devices, these analog devices, with digital ones. So we replaced our analog cameras with digital cameras. We replaced our analog VCRs with digital devices, whether it was Blu-ray or whether it was our DVRs that we now lease or rent or buy from our cable companies and our satellite providers. So we started to replace these analog devices with digital devices, and today we have about 25 digital products per U.S. household. And that's very comparable to what we see in other parts of the world, in developed markets. In emerging markets, it's growing very quickly. And we're now at a really interesting inflection point where we start to move from what I call this first digital decade into the second digital decade. We move beyond just acquiring the digital products to actually integrating them into our life. They become part of what we do and who we are, and ultimately how we interact with one another. And so you can see those inflection points in a variety of places. Last year was one of the first years that digital music outsold physical music for the first time. This year, digital advertising will outsell physical advertising for the first time. So we're starting to see the shift from an analog world to a digital world, taking advantage of this stock of digital products that we've brought into our lives and integrated into our lifestyles. In 2007, Apple launched the very first iPhone. It was only 5 or 6 years ago. Today in the US, over half of US households now have smartphones with them. And we saw in the last panel, the bulk of those in this room, of course, raised their hand to indicate they own a smartphone. One of the unique attributes of this device was that it integrated accelerometers and gyroscopes so that you could control and manipulate three-dimensional space. So you could twist it to rotate where the screen was and how the screen was showing. Earlier, about 6 months prior to that launch, Wii from the Nintendo was launched, which also integrated accelerometers into the controller. So you could, for the first time, start to manipulate and capture in a digital way three-dimensional movement. I would argue that this is the introduction of the sensorization of consumer tech. We started to integrate sensors into these devices. Sensors have now moved from a place where they used to be a scarcity, we used them very sparingly, to eventually becoming a surplus, and we start to waste them. So you can think about the original iPhone, which had on it just one microphone. It would capture your voice, and that was it. Now, one of the defining features of the iPhone 5 is it actually has a microphone in the back to capture and ultimately cancel out ambient noise. We're starting to build multiple microphones into your smartphones. Right now, your phone works very well if you hold it parallel to your mouth, but if you hold it away from your mouth, it doesn't necessarily pick it up. So we're starting to deploy arrays of microphones into your phone so that it can triangulate your voice and pick it up. We start to waste these devices. We used to only include one camera sensor in your phone. Now we include 2 and sometimes 3 camera sensors into your phone. We went from just having accelerometers in the devices to having accelerometers, digital compasses, gyroscopes. So we're starting to deploy these sensors widely, which is allowing us to do a variety of things. We're starting to be able to capture digitally things that used to only be available to us in a physical way. You can think of a digital scale today. The modern day digital scale is connected, so when you step on that, it not only tells you the weight on the device, but it can also allow you to then capture it digitally, store it in a curated service, if you will, that will then tell you, good job, you've lost weight. You know, there are things you can improve. You can send it to Facebook if you were so inclined. You could send it to Twitter if you were so inclined. But I'm going to talk a little bit about what the digitization of all of this information means for us. So let's step forward to 2013. Let's just get a sense of where some of these devices are going as we move forward. This is an app that tells you if you're depressed. It takes advantage of the sensors that are built into the app, the GPS, to determine if you've moved and left the building, left your home. It takes advantage of the accelerometers. The accelerometers are also used in pedometers to tell you if you've moved or not. And so it takes all of this information, which is now available in a digital way, and it can then prompt you if you're if your disposition is towards depression. If you've got issues with depression, then it will prompt you to phone a friend, to get up and move around. It could also prompt others to call you, taking advantage of the data which is captured by the sensors of the device. So we're starting to use all this information in a digital way to influence what's happening in the physical space, the analog space, if you will. So we're starting to see literally the digitization of everyday things as we start to deploy these sensors widely. A couple of examples. Earlier this year at CES, there was an app that was launched and a device that was launched that digitizes your posture to tell you if you've got good posture or bad posture. And you can see the little stick figure icon will turn red and slouch down when the sensors are picking up bad posture. And whenever I talk about this device, I always see everybody sit up just a little bit straighter in the audience. So literally, we're starting to now digitize things like our posture. This looks like an everyday pill bottle top, but in fact, it's one that's connected to the internet. AT&T launched this about 2 years ago. It records when you open that pill bottle, but more importantly, it records when you don't open that pill bottle. And so it can alert you if you forgot to take your medicine, or it can alert your mother or your father if they forgot to take their medicine. It can also call them, but it could also call you. It can text you, it can send you a message, it could call a medical professional or a doctor, a loved one, somebody next door to alert them that, hey, Grandma forgot to take her medicine today, and you can call her and say, did you take your medicine? I'm getting text messages from your pill bottle that says that in fact isn't the case. We're starting to digitize these everyday things. All of that information was known before, but we weren't capturing it in a digital way. This is a moisture sensor that you put in a potted plant, and it tells you when the plant needs to be watered. It will send you a text message that tells you when it needs to be watered. This is actually from a Korean company, and the marketing was slightly off. It said for a pot plant. Right, so it may be taking advantage of new laws in Colorado and elsewhere, but we're starting to, again, digitize these everyday things. That now we can get text messages from our plants that say, don't forsake me, give me water. This is a watch, one of the first devices that measures in continuous time things like your heart rate. And ultimately, we can then start to measure, and it can also measure blood pressure. So it can essentially determine when you're stressed and tell you when you're stressed. Now you think, okay, why do I need to have that in continuous time? Well, it also has, because it's a watch, timestamps. And then you could start to blend that with other streams of data. And to me, that's the key to the second digital decade, that we're starting to now capture this information digitally, and we're going to start to share it across different digital streams of data. So I might be able to take this information in a few years and blend it with my calendar. And so I can see which meetings create the most stress for me. Now, we probably already implicitly know this, but now we can see it quantitatively. You could see how stressful your commute is. And now the next big step in this is we'll start to do things with probe data. We'll start to share this information. So today you're starting to see, for example, GPS information be shared across users. If I'm sharing my GPS information across users, and I'm also capturing my GPS information across users, together with my blood pressure medicine and my calendar, I might be able to get recommendations that say things like, delay your commute for 15 minutes, it will reduce your stress, and at the same time, it doesn't make you much later to your destination. Google last year introduced something they call Google Now, which will take advantage of some of that digital information, things like your calendar and your GPS location, and it will alert you when it's time for you to leave a meeting. If you have a meeting across town or in a different appointment across town, it will alert you that says, hey, if you're trying to get to this meeting on time, you better leave now. Taking advantage of all of these different streams of digital information. For a long time, we've used this idea of smart as a synonym of connected, but it's really becoming much more than that. Smart, moving forward, will mean much more than simply connected. Smartphone being connected to the internet, smart TV being connected to the TV. Some of those examples, this is transparent LCD. So you think, why would I ever want a computer monitor to be transparent? Well, in this example from Samsung, you can see that they've put it in a convenience store, in a 7-Eleven. And you can start to do some really interesting things when you've got a transparent LCD. You can do things like dynamic pricing. You can change the prices for all the products in that glass case remotely. So you could base it upon other things like supply and demand in that local market. You could you could change it based upon when the delivery truck is going to get there and adjust again so that you always have just the right amount of inventory. You end up too short, you raise the price. You end up with too little, then you can, or too much, then you can lower the price. You can adjust it fluidly based upon these other streams of information, again, that are available digitally. For advertising, I could definitely see advertising being influenced by this. Today, you can think of the winning touchdown or the winning field goal or whatever it is, March Madness. Any of those clips don't make it into promotions for several days, weeks, sometimes even months as they work their way through the advertising chain. But now you could do it literally in seconds. So if somebody had an endorsement with Gatorade, they make the winning basket, that image can be sent to that market immediately across these transparent LCDs. And so we're seeing a push towards a variety of different displays. 3 years ago, before Apple launched the iPad, I used to talk about the void in the screen spectrum. From 5 to 15 inches, we had almost no devices. Below 5 inches, you had things like your phones, remote controls. Above 15 inches, you had notebooks, desktops, and televisions. But in between 5 and 15 inches, there were very few devices. We filled that void very quickly with things like tablets. We're now starting to expand the continuum of screen sizes by adding things like smartwatches, by going larger on the displays on the farther end. And eventually, we're going to see that continuum of screens start to influence our everyday life, where these screens are bringing in a variety of different streams of digital information. We're changing the way we interact with computing. We're adding gesture, we're adding voice. I've demoed a product that lets you navigate a computer with your eyes. It syncs to your eyes, and then as you move your eyes across the screen, it will move with you. So you can literally zoom into things as you move your eyes across the screens. We're changing the way we interact with computing. Just one last example. This is a game company called Siftio. They make they make these little cubes, and you can see in this example that he's pouring red paint into the one cube, and you can see the other cube has got green paint on it. He could pick up the green, he could pour it into the computer module, and it would start to change the color. It would mix the red and the green right there on the screen and change the color. The application they see today is gaming, but what you're really seeing happen here is a blurring of the lines between what's happening in the physical space and what's happening in the digital space. You're physically picking up that computer module, you're pouring it, the NFC technology within those devices is recognizing that you're doing something physically, and it's responding in a digital way. And so we can start to think about a variety of these things coming together. If we start to add in the sensorization across devices, together with the blurring of lines between the physical and the digital space, and it has pretty big ramifications for everything we do and ultimately how all of these experiences are powered. So we look a lot at electric vehicles today. Another big trend is driverless vehicles. Google last year touted that they drove 300,000 miles accident-free with their driverless vehicles. Essentially just a vehicle, a Prius in Google's case, with a variety of sensors. And those sensors are taking in real-time information, digitizing it, and then responding to that digital information, making decisions based upon all of that digital information. So we could start to deploy sensors widely, not just across smartphones, not just across vehicles like the Prius, but across a wide array of devices and applications that will change the type of things that we do. Hopefully I've left you with a few things to think about as we think about how technology is evolving. Again, sometimes these cycles can be very long, but we're starting to see just the tip of the iceberg where, again, the physical lines and the digital lines are blurring, and ultimately how we'll interact with this technology is changing. Thank you very much.